Welcome back to Storytime. Pastor Lori, pastor of the Fairton and Newport United Methodist Churches. I've got another story for us. This month is Black History Month, and so if we talk about Black history, we always talk about Harriet Tubman. At least that's what I remember growing up. Every February. It's an Underground Railroad, right? That's what I remember, but there's a lot more to her story than just that. So we're going to meet Harriet Tubman. This is the artist's rendition of her. She was born Arminta Ross. Arminta Ross wasn't the type of child people imagine would grow up to be a leader. In fact, she was born with many odds against her. Surprisingly, her biggest challenge would be the reason she became known as the brave leader Harriet Tubman. It's because she was born into a life of slavery. Arminta's journey to become Harriet Tubman wasn't easy. Her entire family was enslaved. As a child, she saw her parents and siblings struggle as they worked on a plantation. Because Arminta's family members were slaves, they didn't get paid for the hard work they were forced to do. When Arminta was just 5, she was forced to work as well. As Arminta grew older, she became determined to free herself and her family from slavery forever. On her journey in search of freedom, Arminta grew from a young slave girl into a courageous woman named Harriet Tubman. Harriet spent much of her life helping other enslaved people gain their freedom. She put herself in danger countless times to help others. Harriet even served as a spy during the American Civil War. When Harriet became known for her brave acts, she used her fame to help even more people. So how did Harriet's story begin? Well, around 1822, Harriet Green and Benjamin Ross had their 5th child, a daughter named Arminta Ross, who would grow up to become known as the hero Harriet Tubman. Historians believe Arminta was born on a plantation in Dorchester County, Maryland. Exact date and location of her birth wasn't known because of being enslaved. And have records for that, I guess. Arminta was often called by her nickname, Minty. She was one of many descendants of African people who were captured and sold into slavery. The Broaddus family owned Minty's parents, which meant they also owned Minty. Because Minty's parents were enslaved, they couldn't afford to buy her presents. But Minty's father was a good carpenter and made a wooden cradle for his newborn daughter. There you are. Slavery was a system in which some people were forced to work on plantations, harvesting crops. Other enslaved people were forced to cook, clean, and take care of others' homes and children. In America, white people of European ancestry mainly used black people of African ancestry as slave labor. Enslaved black people were considered property and often treated poorly. Enslaved people were not paid for their work, and slave owners often sold them to other people, other plantations, which separated their family. By 1804, the northern states had ended slavery. So most enslaved people worked on plantations in the South. People who escaped slavery and ran away to the north were considered free. Many people tried to escape, but those slaves were captured and returned to their slave owners. They were badly punished and sometimes killed. Minty's mother was one of the Broaddus family's house slaves. She had to cook their meals. Minty's father was the woodworker for the plantation. He was often forced to do woodworking for neighbors, too. Enslaved people's lives was difficult. They were forced to work long hours, punished if they didn't do what their owners demanded. Many slave owners were very cruel. They used whips and canes to beat their slaves. So most slaves did as they were told. They were afraid of what would happen if they disobeyed or tried to escape to the north. Before Minty was 5 years old, she did not have to work as a slave. Still, she saw the long hours her parents, sibling, and other enslaved people worked. Minty also saw her loved ones being mistreated. And as she grew older, Minty was determined not to spend her entire life in slavery. Here's another picture, the early years. I guess that's like drawing of her on the plantation. Enslaved people were forced to harvest crops were known as field slaves. Okay, field slaves had to work outside for hours in the hot sun. Enslaved people who worked in the home were known as house slaves. Their work wasn't easy, but it was considered better than working in the field. It makes sense because it's hot and hard working in the field. Minty's mother hoped Mr. Brodus wouldn't make her daughter a house slave. She didn't want Minty to have a difficult life in the field. But even though Minty was her daughter, Minty was considered the property of the Brodus family, and Mr. Brodus would determine Minty's fate. Minty didn't get to go to school. It was considered a crime for enslaved people to learn how to read or write. But like many slaves, Minty's parents memorized the Bible stories told at church. Minty loved it when her mother told her Bible stories. She devoted her life to serving God as a young girl. Soon, she could recite Bible stories and long scriptures from memory. As she grew older, her father taught her about nature by taking her outside. She learned about the many different types of trees and plants. She loved it most when she and her father went outside at night. Together they'd look up into the night sky as Minty's father explained all the different patterns of the stars. He was the first person to tell Minty about the North Star, the brightest star in the sky. He told her that people who wanted to escape slavery followed that North Star to freedom. Okay, and this kind of shows where she was. This would have been kind of where the plantation was. Minty was 5 or 6 years old when Mr. Brodus decided it was time for her to work. He sent her to work for the Cook family. She would check their muskrat traps. The Cooks were mean. Whenever they thought Minty wasn't doing a good job, they beat her. Once Minty caught the measles, became very ill, but the Cooks thought Minty was just being lazy, and they told Mr. Brodus they no longer wanted her to work for them. Next, Mr. Brodus sent Minty to work for his neighbor, Miss Susan. She was a new mother and used Minty as a babysitter. Minty watched, changed, and fed Miss Susan's baby. But Miss Susan never wanted to hear her baby crying. And that was an impossible task because all babies cry. Whenever Miss Susan heard her baby fussing, Minty was punished. Minty didn't like how Miss Susan treated her, but she thought her home was very lovely. Minty liked to go from room to room and look at Miss Susan's fancy things. So here's a drawing of her with the baby. Of course, it's crying in the picture. And lady's mad. One day, Minty saw sugar cubes in the kitchen, and she took one. It was a big mistake. Miss Susan was watching. Enslaved people who were caught stealing, even something as small as a sugar cube, were punished. When Minty realized Miss Susan had seen her, she ran and hid it inside a pig pen, where no one would find her. But she knew she couldn't hide there forever. After 5 days, she returned to face her punishment and was beaten so badly she almost died. When Minty got better, Mr. Brodus sent her to work in the field. So here's kind of a drawing of her working out in the field. I don't know if that's tobacco or what that's supposed to be. Minty quickly discovered that being a field slave was much harder than checking the cook's muskrat traps and babysitting for Miss Susan. Every day Minty worked in the hot sun. Mr. Brodus hired an overseer to watch the field slaves harvesting crops. If the overseer saw Minty or anyone else resting or working too slowly, they would get punished. Harvesting tobacco. See, that was right. Harvesting tobacco was hard work for her. Minty did as she was told so the overseer wouldn't think she was lazy. She hated watching the overseer beat other people for working too slowly. Being in the field made Minty long for her freedom even more. In the summer of 1831, Minty learned that an enslaved man named Nat Turner tried to escape from a plantation in Virginia. Marion slave owners like the Broduses were worried because Nat didn't just run away, he started a rebellion. After Nat killed his owner and freed himself, he freed other enslaved people on that plantation. Then Nat asked for their help to free as many enslaved people as possible. Together they went to other plantations, killed dozens of white slave owners, and freed more people. Eventually, Nat and those who helped him were captured. But after such a deadly rebellion, Many slave owners feared the same thing could happen on their plantation. Here's like a drawing of him. Minty knew that she could never kill Mr. Brodess. She was very curious about another way she had heard people escaping slavery, the Underground Railroad. And as Minty grew older, she continued to dream of freedom for herself and other enslaved people. When she was around 12 years old, a slave tried to escape the Brodess plantation and was captured. While he was being punished, Minnie tried to protect him. Sadly, Minnie was struck in the head with such force that she almost died. Her wounds eventually healed, but she was never the same. She had terrible sleeping spells that caused her to pass out without warning. Because Minty could no longer work in the field, Mr. Brodess gave her a different task to do around the plantation. But she still was not free. Minty believed her sleeping spells made her mind stronger than it was ever before her injury, and that God now spoke to her through her dreams. She said, "In my dreams and visions, I seem to see a line. On the other side of that line were green fields and lovely flowers." She often dreamed she was talking to angels about escaping slavery. Soon, Minnie would need her strong mind to do important work for her people. It says, "Freedom is calling." You can see she's getting ready to help others find freedom. From Minty to Harriet Tubman, it says, when Minty was a young woman, she changed her name. She thought Minty sounded childlike for someone who had survived so much. She renamed herself Harriet in honor of her mother. When Harriet was hired out to chop timber for a shipyard owner named John Stewart around 1840, she worked extra hard. Sometimes Mr. Stewart had money left over after he paid Mr. Brodess for Harriet's work. Whenever he gave Harriet the extra money, she saved it. When the time came for Harriet to escape, she knew she would need the money. In 1844, Harriet met John Tubman, a free black man. He asked Harriet to marry him. Even though John was free, he didn't have the same privileges as a white man did. Harriet would be his wife, but she would still be considered the property of Mr. Brodess. If John and Harriet had children, their children would become the property of Mr. Brodess as well. Here's a drawing of when she was chopping wood. Despite these challenges, Harriet agreed to marry John. When Harriet was around 25 years old, she became Mrs. Harriet Tubman. She sewed a beautiful quilt to honor the union. Harriet continued to dream about escaping slavery. One day, Harriet told John about her visions. Rather than support her, John said he would turn her in if she tried to escape. Wow. Harriet never spoke to him about her dreams again. In 1849, Harriet heard that Mr. Brodess planned to sell some of his slaves and send them farther south where slavery was much worse. Harriet was terrified. She prayed that Mr. Brodess would change his mind. She said, "I prayed all night long for my master till the 1st of March. But Mr. Brodess didn't change his mind. So Harriet changed her prayer. Oh Lord, if you ain't never going to change that man's heart, kill him and take him out of the way." When Mr. Brodess died a week later, I guess you got to watch how you pray. She felt guilty and afraid. No one knew what was going to happen next. Harriet sisters, Lena, Soph, and Mariah, had been sold a few years earlier. Harriet didn't want that to happen to her brothers, Henry and Ben. So she came up with a plan to use the Underground Railroad to escape. On September 17, 1849, Harriet, Ben, and Henry fled into the night. Harriet was excited to finally start the journey north, just as she always dreamed. Along the way, Henry and Ben became afraid. Harriet tried to convince them to continue the trip, but they decided to return to the Brodess Popper Neck plantation. Harriet went with them to make sure they got back safely, but she didn't stay. 2 days later, she gathered her money, a little bit of food, and her wedding quilt. She escaped alone. Just as her father had taught her, Harriet followed the North Star as her guide. Some people were willing to help anyone trying to escape slavery. These people left items like lit lanterns outside their homes along the secret route of the Underground Railroad. Harriet saw one of those lanterns outside the home of a Quaker woman who let Harriet come inside and rest. She then told Harriet how to get to the next safe house. Harriet was so grateful that she gave the woman her wedding quilt in thanks. Over several days, many other kind and brave people helped Harriet travel north. After she walked nearly 90 miles, she finally crossed the border into Pennsylvania. Harriet was free. She promised one day to return to Poplar Neck to free her family as well. So next chapter, Liberty for All. From the moment she crossed to Pennsylvania, Harriet loved the feeling of freedom. She said, when I found I had crossed that line, I looked at my hands to see if I was the same person. There was such a glory over everything. The sun came like gold through the trees and over the fields, and I felt like I was in heaven. With the help of the Pennsylvania Vigilance Committee, Harriet went to Philly. The committee helped people to escape slavery find jobs and keep in touch with their family members who were still enslaved. Its chair, Mr. William Still, helped Harriet find work as a maid. She saved every dollar she owned. She planned to use the money to rescue her family. One day, Harriet found out that her niece, Keziah, and her two children, James and Arminta, name sounds familiar, were about to be sold. Harriet returned to Maryland. She hid in a safe house until Keziah and her children could meet her. Then Harriet used that Underground Railroad to lead them all to freedom. For Harriet, it was the first of many trips. Harriet continued to travel to help free more of her family members and close friends. And here's a drawing. There was posters for her. And they called her Moses Tubman, Harriet Moses Tubman. It was Moses of her people. So then Congress passed a law that made her work more dangerous. The Fugitive Slave Law, 1850, said people who escaped slavery and who were found in the North could be returned to their former owners in the South. Anyone who helped these people escape slavery could be jailed, fined, or worse. Slave owners heard about Harriet offered large rewards, like the poster I just showed, for anyone who would capture her. Even though she had to be more careful, Harriet continued to risk her life to free people. She wore disguises and often dressed and acted like an old woman to appear harmless. Harriet helped so many people escape that her nickname was Moses, like the man in the Bible who led his people to freedom. Harriet asked her husband to join her in Philly. She knew his life would be better if he lived in a free state, but Harriet learned that John had already married another woman. Harriet continued to work and acted like a conductor for the Underground Railroad. She had only one rule. Any person who joined her on the trip north could not turn back. Because of this rule, she never lost a single passenger. Because people who escaped slavery and who were caught in the North could be returned, Harriet started taking people all the way to Canada. Slavery is no longer legal in Canada, and that country did not have this fugitive slave law either. Many former slaves started a community in St. Catharines, Ontario. Harriet helped many people, including her elderly parents and brothers, escape to St. Catharines. She had fulfilled her promise to free her loved ones and others from the horrors of slavery. And now, next thing is General Tubman. This is the part where she helped during the war, I guess. In time, Harriet set up house for her family in Auburn, New York. It was wonderful for them to be together again, but her work wasn't finished. Many people remained trapped in slavery. Harriet could not save everyone, but she often gave speeches about the need to abolish slavery. Because Harriet was so popular, she was paid to speak at these events. She always saved her money to continue her work. Sometimes Harriet's work came to her by surprise. On April 27th, 1860, Harriet was visiting Troy, New York, when she learned that a former slave named Charles Nail, N-A-L-L-E, had been captured while looking for his wife and their children. Harriet disguised herself as an old woman, found Charles, and helped get him away. Others helped him escape to a nearby city. But Charles wasn't safe yet. Slave catchers tracked him and captured him again. This time, Harriet and others stormed the building in which he was being held. They freed Charles once again. this time for good. When slave owners heard that Harriet had helped rescue Charles, they were furious. They increased their bounty for anyone who captured her. She ticked a lot of people off, I bet. Harriet's family and friends were worried for her safety. They convinced her to stop using the Underground Railroad, but Harriet soon found another way to help. America's Civil War began on April 12, 1861. Northern states that wanted to end slavery formed the Union Army. Southern states that wanted to keep enslaving people formed the Confederate Army. Many enslaved and freed black men served in the Union Army. Some women like Harriet served as well. The governor of Massachusetts, John A. Andrew, was an abolitionist. He knew that because of her work, Harriet was very familiar with the terrain of the South, so he asked her to help Union troops there. And he was quoted as saying, "Harriet, you are to act as a spy, scout, or nurse as the circumstance require." Harriet said yes and went to the South Carolina, where she worked as a nurse and spied on Confederate soldiers. She also served as a liaison between the Union soldiers and enslaved people. Harriet was so respected in the Union Army, she became commander of intelligence operations for the Union Army's Department of the South. 9 men served under her command. One of Harriet's biggest successes was in 1863, when she led some 150 black Union Army soldiers along the Combahee River in South Carolina to rescue more than 700 slaves. Harriet's service ended in 1865 when the Union Army defeated the Confederate Army. All enslaved people in America were soon to be given their freedom. Here's some nice drawings. This is her. And then we have more work to be done. There's always something to be done, right? When the Civil War ended, Harriet was grateful. Black people were finally free. So Harriet went home to Auburn, New York, to care for her elderly parents. Many of her family members joined her there. Sadly, Harriet was unable to save everyone in her family before slavery was abolished. She was unable to rescue her older sister Rachel and her sister's children, Ben and Angerine. But Harriet was thankful for every loved one she did save. After slavery ended, many southern states created new laws called black codes to limit the rights of former slaves. Harriet saw how these laws made it hard for her people to find work or health care. Many black people were still poor and others became sick. Harriet saw all black people as her brothers and sisters, so she turned her home into a boarding house to provide food and shelter for those in need. Harriet met her second husband, Nelson Davis, when he actually stayed in our boarding house. They married in 1869, and together they ran a farm and brick business. In 1874, they adopted a daughter, Gertie. Taking care of other people was expensive. Harriet had served in the Civil War, but military didn't pay her as they promised. She had to use the money from her farm and business to run the boarding house. Later, when Harriet was paid for 2 biographies written about her life, she knew exactly what she was going to do with the money. Harriet dreamed of creating a home and hospital for poor people, who at that time were called indigent. Soon she had enough money to buy the land across the street from her house. There she built the Tubman home for aged and indigent. That's a hard word for me to say. Anyhow, Harriet grew vegetables on her farm to feed the poor people who lived in her home. Harriet also earned money for the Tubman home by giving talks about women's rights. Formerly enslaved black people had limited rights. During this time, women also had few rights and were not allowed to vote. Just as Harriet had spoken about ending slavery, she now spoke to help women get the right to vote. As more people learned about Harriet's life and her work to help others, she became even more popular. Around 1897, Harriet received from Queen Victoria of England a letter and a gift, a shawl made of white silk, lace, and linen. When Harriet became too old and frail to work, she gave her property to her church, the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. She knew her church would continue the important work that she had begun. She died on March 10th, 1913. Her amazing life story will be forever loved and respected in American history. And the last quote she has, "I was the conductor of the Underground Railroad for 8 years, and I can say what most conductors can't say. I never ran my train off the track, and never lost a passenger. So that is a life of Harriet Tubman. Thanks for tuning in. Love you guys. Have a great week. Bye.